Now the session's officially recording, and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get into JavaScript part 5. Woohoo, get excited, get hyped. This is our project. Ignore that. That's our project. Okay, let's do JavaScript part 5, guys. So today we're going to be talking about manipulating the DOM. Now, what is the DOM? Well, you already know what the DOM is. The DOM is the document object model, and it's a tree-like representation of the contents of a web page. So let's go to our demo Replit link. Our lovely instructor Christian made this for us. This is some like manipulating the DOM examples. So it's basically just like the content of our web page. See, we have this one that's highlighted blue, you know, this one that is green in color a little bit. You can't really tell. But this is what the DOM is. The DOM is our content of our web page, and manipulating the DOM is manipulating the contents of our web page. So yeah, it's a fun lesson. IDS is basically, so not IDS. Why did I read it like that? IDs. Giving an element an ID attribute allows it to be selected in the JavaScript code. So basically by saying, oh, this element, like giving it an ID name, like giving it identification, it allows it to be used within the JavaScript code, which therefore allows us to manipulate the DOM. A specific ID cannot be reused by other elements. This is important to note because you don't want to have two things that are like going on at the same time. That's also important to note because if you name, like, it won't run if you name things the same thing, and if you name things the same name, it might run, but it might just manipulate things in a way that you don't want them to. So always make sure you're using different names for different things so that they correspond correctly when you're manipulating the DOM. All right. Fetching elements. So remember how we have each element has an ID name. So the fetching elements, we're going to say, this is kind of like the syntax of it. If we can, let me use my pointer. This is like the syntax of it. So like document dot get element by ID, and then bracket ID name. Let's talk about through this. So document dot get. So we're going to say, okay, get the thing. So in the document, we're going to get it. Get element by ID. So we're going to say, okay, you're going to get an element, but you're going to get it through its ID. You're not going to get it through like a tag like headers. You're going to get it through like its specific element name, and you're going to put the element name in these brackets. Yeah, hopefully that makes some sense. I want to take note that like these are case sensitive. So you notice how we have some weird like all lowercase, and then capital of the first letter, capital of the first letter, capital of the first letter. These are case sensitive, so like be careful with that when you're doing it. And that's just the one thing to note when we're going through, when you're saying document.get element by ID. A string is passed on to .get element by ID as an argument and can be saved into a variable. So we're just manipulating it into different various forms of data, and saving it into a variable allows it to be manipulated later on, which is useful when we're doing things like counters, for example. All elements with a certain class name can be fetched by get elements by class name. Yeah, so like a class like middle, a class like, I think we have a class called middle in the example today, so I'm going to use that example like class, so it would be like dot get elements by class name bracket middle. So that would be what you're going to see in the code today. Here's an example of that is the syntax of variable element. So an element called variable, or a variable called element equals document dot get element by ID. So the name is ID, lowercase. How's it going so far? Do we have some questions? How are we feeling? Yes, no, maybe. I'm going to look at the chat. Yeah. Yes, no, maybe, thumbs up, thumbs down. I see no thumbs up. I see no thumbs down. Okay, one thumbs up. Chat. Can you explain that again? Okay. I'm going to explain fetching elements again. Okay, so fetching elements basically just means when we want to work with a specific element, we're going to call it. So remember how we like called variables, we called methods, we called functions? Not methods, because you guys don't know about methods yet. We're doing that today. Calling functions. Remember how we called functions and we said like function, you know, and then we called it by saying the function name and then brackets. So it's basically the same thing. Whenever we want to manipulate an element, we just have to call it with this specific syntax. Yeah, so this is the specific syntax to call an element, and when we call it, we're just calling it so we can work with it and manipulate it. Okay? So, event listeners. After fetching elements, an event on that element can trigger JavaScript code to run. Yeah, so what event listeners kind of are, if we're going to think about it in like layman's terms, is that an event listener is like, it's like a puppy, right? So the puppy sits there and sits there and it sits there and it sits there. And the puppy waits for keywords, right? So if you say come, the puppy will come to you. If you say sit, the puppy sits. Event listeners are just like that. So when you give them specific commands, they listen for specific things. And when those specific things happen, they complete actions accordingly. So like when you say sit, the event listener would sit. If you say come to me, the event listener would come to you, as like a puppy example. We use them in Java because we want to say like when this thing happens, trigger this line of code. So like say if we have a dice game where we pick random numbers and we say like, oh, like we're rolling digital dice. And we pick random numbers. Our event listener could be like, if we roll 2 6s, trigger code, like you won the game. You know, like that's a good example of event listener. So when something happens, the event listener picks that thing up and then executes code. Events can also range from actions, just like keys or clicks. So like when we click on a web page, that could be an event. This is the example for add event listener click. So like this would be add.event listener. So add event listener, click. So when we click the web page, display date. So it would display the date, the given date. And we can do that because date is like a programmed in function in Java. So you can always like get date and time and you don't have to like do external programming for that. Yeah? Yes, no, maybe? I'll go back. Yes, no, maybe? Hopefully. Yes, no, maybe. What does the event listener do? The event listener just listens for the event and then tells the subsequent code to run. So that's what the event listener does. The event listener just like waits for a certain thing to happen, and then once that thing happens, it just tells the code that this thing happened so that like code can run. Yeah, so it's basically just like an intermediary, kind of. Yeah, okay. Chat. Yeah, okay. Manipulating events. So we have our events. So events like are things that happen in our web page, things that happen in our code. The content, attributes, and styles of selected elements can be changed with JavaScript. So like our like the content of our web page can be changed through JavaScript. And that's the whole point of today's lesson. The whole point of today's lesson is manipulating the DOM. And we can change the contents of the JavaScript through we can change the contents of the web page through JavaScript, and we can call that manipulating events because events can be whatever. So that's what we're doing here. So in this example, document.getElementById, some random ID, .inner HTML, hello there. Let's go through this. Document.getElementById. We already know this. We're getting an element by ID. The ID name is something random ID. So we're looking for something called something random ID. Yes? So we're going to go and try and look at all the elements by ID. And once we say, oh, we found something random ID, we're going to take it .inner HTML. So we're going to use our like coded in HTML, and we're going to say hello there. Let's go through inner HTML. So remember a couple examples ago, we had like script in our HTML page, right? So we had something that said like it was a function that ran. I think the most recent example of this is probably last week, where we saw like JavaScript code within our HTML page. JavaScript, CSS, and HTML are all interchangeable. They all work together on a web page. So you could program HTML within a JavaScript file when using .inner HTML, because you're saying, oh, like right here, this is HTML code. So they all work in tandem like that. You can use JavaScript within an HTML file. You can use some HTML in a CSS file. You can, mix and match them like that. But there's certain syntax you need to use to do that. So when you're in a JavaScript file and you want to change some HTML, you're going to put .inner HTML to signify it's HTML, and then it will change the web page's HTML within your JavaScript file. Oops, sorry. So that's what this does. Get elements by ID gets some random dot ID, gets dot inner HTML, then it just says hello there. Now we're going to go and we're going to look at the next example. Replaces existing content with the element ID attribute as it's assigned. So document.get element by ID, some random ID. We know what this does. Yes, get some random ID. Dot set attribute value. So say some random ID was like a flex box, right? So say that our flex box called some random ID had a flex box is just like a box on your screen that you can change the dimensions of. And say we wanted to have the box be 100 pixels by 100 pixels. That's how it starts out. By doing this, we say like set attribute, our attribute could be width and the value could be 200. So now all of a sudden our box is 200 by 100. So doing this, you can change attributes of HTML elements within your JavaScript code. Manipulating events. So changes a specific style property of a selected element. Property can be background color, margin, etc. Right? So we talked about our properties. The styling for that specific property goes into value. So remember, we had our width and then 200 pixels, right? So the specific way we want to style it and then the styling element. So width, 200 pixels. In this way, we're going to do document.get element by ID, some random ID. We know what this means. Dot style, CSS. As soon as you see style, you should know that that's CSS. Dot property, so property, like what is the property we want to change? Sticking to our example, dot width, value, 200 pixels. Yeah? How do we feel about that? Yes, no, maybe, reactions. I see nothing in the chat, so I'm assuming we're okay. Okay, 1 thumbs up, 2. Okay, awesome. So methods. Methods are actions that are performed on objects in JavaScript. So like one specific action that's performed on an object is a method, right? So like functions can be a series of actions, but like one action is a method. Accessing a method, so like calling a method, remember how we called functions? Accessing a method or calling a method goes as follows. So object name dot method name, right? So we want to talk about the object we're talking about, then the method we want to call, so like what method it is. And it's very similar as our function syntax. Remember function? So we just have the function name and then brackets. Well, this is just method name and then brackets, but we also have the object name. There are also several built-in methods. So remember how math, we have our like built-in math functions? Well, if you're talking about something like a string, like we know it's a string, you can use built-in methods like to uppercase, which changes all of your words into uppercase. So like they're all capital letters. So there's built-in methods like that, just like there are built-in methods for the math portion as well. Okay, is there any questions? This is the end of the lesson. So is there anything we want to go back and talk about, or are we good?
Excuse me?
Yeah.
So maybe we can go over the important points again.
The important points? What do you mean by that?
Like the important stuff.
Can you give me like a question that you had? Because there's a lot of important things, you know? So like, was there like a specific area you wanted to go over again? Because there's a lot of important things. Like we talked about a lot this lesson. So I don't want to like go through it all again if we don't need to, especially if there's people who get it. So if there's a specific question you have, can you try and narrow it down a little bit and then we can talk privately during the breakout rooms?
Well, if you go back a few slides, like 2 or 3, I think.
Okay, tell me when to stop.
Like right after this. Wait, hold on, right after this.
This one.
No, like forward.
This one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay. What's the question?
I don't really understand it.
Okay. So manipulating events is basically just we're talking about like, so remember we have our event examples like key clicks or key clicks, or key clicks is a good example. So an event is like events are something that happens within our web page that we can like look for, and then when it happens, we can do something about it. So a good example is like a key click. So when we say like, oh, like the web page has been clicked, we can do something. Like we can like display the date. We can say like, hello there. We can do all these things. Manipulating events is basically just saying like, oh, we're gonna use JavaScript to manipulate the event. So we're gonna say like what happens when the event happens, right? So like document.getElementById, summary and ID. We have an element here. So we have an element, it has an ID. We're using HTML so that we change it to hello there. So we're changing the event, right? So in this case, we're setting attributes. So we're changing the code through JavaScript. So we're changing certain events through JavaScript, if that makes sense. If you still don't get it, we can talk about it later. Okay. So guys, let's go into our project for today. I will, as always, drop the submission link and the Replit link in the chat. Give me 2 seconds to do that. And yeah, we're going to get through it today. I'm going to go through the Replit code as always, and then we're going to get into our challenges for this week in our project. Yeah, this one was a short lesson, guys. But you guys are really like getting on your way with coding, so that's good. Okay, that's the Replit, and I'll drop the submission form. There you go. So that's your Replit, that's your submission form. As always, we're going to go to the Replit and we're going to make sure that we fork it because that's always important to remember. Yeah. So make sure we fork it, guys. Make sure that's what we do. We're going to have to fork it, remember? And I'll share my screen so we can go through the Replit together. If we have any Minecraft fans in the house, there are some Minecraft references in the Replit today, so I hope you enjoy those. We tried to make the image fun, so. Okay, so we're gonna look and we're gonna notice that our script file, first of all, is completely empty. This is intentional. You're gonna be using your JavaScript within your HTML file to manipulate the DOM. That's the whole point of today's assignment. I want everyone's script file to be completely blank. Let's go through the code. Index.html, we have our metadata. We never concern ourselves with that. First of all, divider, class, center, ID, letters. What is this? Element and ID. We know what that is. We have a class called center, and we're going to call it ID letters, right? Because we're talking about the letters. And what this says is we want all of our colors to be centered, and we call it class center because we want to manipulate everything in here. So we give it a class, and we call the ID that class so we can manipulate everything in here. And we do that within our CSS file. So here we just have HELLO, exclamation point, pretty letters, fun colors. Then we're going to end that divider, new class, class center, ID shapes. So we have shapes and letters, but both under the class center because we both want them to be centered. So we both want them to have that same style attribute. So we have shapes, we have width 100 and 100 and background color blue. Height 10 pixels, class center, 200, 100, background color red. So we have two different ones, 100 by 100, 200 by 100, two different shapes. Yes, they're both in the class center. They both have different sizes. They're both different colors. Yeah? So we have classes with IDs. That's what this is showing us here. Another one that says class center input container. Again, class center, same as always, ID input container. Input type text, value 2 boxes above my head. Input box with text, we know what that is. Class center, once again, ID, the span, quote, different ID, same class. Style, margins, border style, border radius, all of these fun things where it says change what this says. And then last we have our image. So we have our source, our alt in case our image doesn't load, our style. We have our class, and then we have styling, so margin, width, and then a caption. So our assignments for today are to change the colors of each letter, change the colors of the shapes, change what's in the input box, change what this says, span, change the scenery image source, change the caption for the image. Optional, add a new button that makes all of these changes when clicked. Yeah, this sounds like a lot. I promise you can do it. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to answer questions, and we're going to go through the Replit together. Okay?